Mr. Mike Opere Group, Vice Chairman, diplomats, distinguished guests, all protocols observed, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. I feel very delighted to stand before you this morning in order to have a discussion with you about a subject that is of great importance to the peoples of Africa. I'm standing here in Nigeria, very much aware that out of every 5 working black men in the world, one of them is a Nigerian. So Nigeria, therefore, is a giant on our continent. And they say that when Nigeria coughs, the other part of Africa catch colds. So I'm honored to be speaking to you at this distinguished forum on a subject of credible elections and economies in transition. I was invited at this time. I don't know whether I was the right person to talk about this subject today, but I'm going to try my best not to disappoint. This discussion comes at a time we are grappling with this same matter back home in Kenya, following our last elections last year. Professor Makau has shared with you certain issues, but I don't want to go in that direction. Back home, I have expressed fears that if we do not comprehensively and credibly address the issue of credibility of this election outcome last year, the virus will spread and affect the upcoming elections on the continent. More immediately, Kenyans may lose all faith and decide to boycott the future elections because they will believe their votes do not matter. Kenya has become a laboratory for bad election practices that others borrow around the continent. You may recall that our malpractices of 2007 quickly became the script for Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Since then, more of our neighbors have followed suit and perfected the use of technology to override the will of the people, the voters. As a Pan-Africanist and as an Afro-optimist, I fully subscribe to and support Africa's Agenda 2063, which seeks the socio-economic transformation of the continent. And I'm also a student of late Kwame Nkrumah, who said that Africa must unite in order to progress. But I want to send a red flag at this forum. If Africa wants to achieve the goals of Agenda 2063, then we must prioritize and entrench free, fair, and credible elections by all member states. Since the reintroduction of multi-party politics in the 1990s, the quality and credibility of our elections have steadily deteriorated. You remember the struggle for democratization of the continent. From the independence in the 60s to the 70s, 80s, Africans were struggling because the period after independence, most multi-party systems were discarded and single-party dictatorships took root, followed by military coups that took place in the continent. The Africans were struggling to open up the democratic space. It was not until the fall of the Berlin Wall and that the wind of change that began to blow in the Eastern Europe fought its way into our continent. The military dictatorship then crumbled, and the single-party dictatorships and gave way to multi-party elections. In many of our countries today, election management bodies have been captured by the ruling parties or individual politicians, making it impossible to have fair contests. The capture leads to skewed processes like voter registration, appointment of election management officials with disastrous consequences. As a continent, we have to agree that critical development efforts cannot succeed without a legitimate and democratically elected government that is responsive and accountable to its citizens and to the investor community. Free and fair elections are indicators to investors that there is the government which is in place that believes in fairness and the rule of law. When a government comes in through a fair ballot, investors get the reassurance that their property will be respected, taxation will be fair, investment rules will be simple and clear, and they will not have to resort to corruption and bribery to set up or stay in business. Illiberal regimes send signals that are direct opposite of what investors are looking for. Professor Mike touched on Boise State University in the US wrote, and I quote, "Many investors conclude that governments that violate electoral laws to stay in office would also be willing to violate investors' property rights. If the election was rigged and the leader is overriding laws and constitutional provisions, no one in the country can stand up to the government. And so investment falls because there's a lot of economic risk in doing business in countries with unconstrained governments," unquote. Regimes that come to power by rigged elections cannot guarantee judicial independence and other state and non-governmental bodies that are critical to the rule of law, which is an indispensable requirement for a good investment climate. We therefore need to internalize the fact that elections are important political risk assessment tools for investors. Investors look at how elections are being conducted before they can risk their investment in that environment. I must hasten to add here that by investors, I'm not simply talking about foreign investments. I refer also, most importantly, to domestic investors. Africa has seen swings in fortunes before, from bad to better and back to worse. Much, if not all of those swings, have resulted from elections that fail to meet the minimum standards for free elections. In other cases, there are no elections at all. In the mid-1990s, Africa was very hopeful following the introduction of multi-party politics on the continent. Our leaders and intellectuals proclaimed an African renaissance. The grim days of post-colonial Africa were declared over. The Cold War, too, was over, and with it, the misrule and dictatorships perpetuated by military rulers, big men, and presidents for life. I recall in 1994, our very own President Nelson Mandela, Madiba, declared, and I quote, "Africa cries out for a new birth. We must, in action, say that there's no obstacle big enough to stop us from bringing about a new African renaissance," unquote. I recall then when President Bill Clinton set out on a six-nation visit to Africa in 1998, his destination were the countries that were seen to be shepherding this renaissance. The nations were also viewed to have a new generation of leaders that would protect and champion the ideals of democracy and economic prosperity. Ghana, Uganda, Rwanda, South Africa, Botswana, and Senegal, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Mali, Democratic Republic of Congo, then under President Laurent Kabila, were among them. Ahead of the President Clinton's visit, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright proclaimed, I quote, "The era of the big man who comes to power, stays for life, and robs his country blind is over," unquote. Unfortunately, she spoke too soon. We now know that the era was not over. We also know that the fortunes of the countries that were seen to be shepherding the Renaissance have swung back and forth over the past several decades, and some are worse off today. In a number of cases, those who are lauded as a new generation of African leaders have become a new generation of African strongmen and tyrants. They preside over de facto one-party states that do not allow for self-government and have not established mechanisms for peaceful transfer of power. Without that guarantee, the growth we see in some of those countries today and the stability the authoritarian regimes seem to have enforced are sure to collapse at some stage, and those countries will have to begin afresh. Elections and democracy are failing in Africa, not because a majority of African voters prefer authoritarianism, non-democratic forms of government. It is happening because an organized elite keen to protect narrow selfish interests has forged strategic alliances and captured strategic systems and institutions of various nations with the sole purpose of subverting the substance of elections. In a number of countries, we are witnessing a situation in which the majority is increasingly at the mercy of the minority with regard to free, fair, transparent, and credible elections. Africans who wake up at dawn, stand in long queues all day to cast their ballot, end up with results that indicate their voters were not counted and did not count. In the last decade, many of our nations have evolved modern systems for collection, coalition, transmission, and tallying of election results. Many have adopted a result management systems that combine traditional vote counting and tallying processes and the use of technology to verify voter eligibility, register voters, and transmit results. In addition, we have seen the evolution of the electoral laws to allow representatives of political parties to independently tally the results and transmit to party tallying centers. But as we have witnessed in Kenya both in 2017 and 2022, technology is getting compromised and results altered. This has severely damaged the credibility of election management bodies in many of our countries. Let us cite an example. According to Gallup poll, 64% of Kenyans did not have confidence in the honesty of elections as we prepared for the 2022 elections. Similarly, the Afrobarometer survey shows that 24% of Kenyans thought that the elections are not at all free and fair. A further 18% thought that elections may be free and fair, but there are major problems. Only 23% of Kenyans thought that elections are completely free and fair as we headed to the polls. The Afrobarometer survey further showed that 31% of Kenyans did not trust our election management body, the IEBC, at all, and 23% trusted it only a little. Only 19% trusted the IEBC a lot. According to the Gallup poll, the percentage of Kenyans who have confidence in the honesty of elections declined from 58% in 2015 to only 35% in 2021. I believe the picture is pretty much the same in many African countries. Existing electoral laws are not seen to assemble an electoral system that the people believe is transparent, accountable, and democratic. There's therefore need for further reforms to make the voting process more accessible and reliable, enhance protections against mistakes, irregularity, confusion, and fraud. There's need to rethink the use of technology. Either we adopt a reliable election technology, including voting machines, and generate a voter verifiable audit trail, so voters can confirm that their choices are being recorded accurately, or we go fully manual. In Kenya, the Supreme Court ruled that the technology used by the IEBC in the 2022 election met the constitutional standards of integrity, verifiability, security, and transparency. It is unclear on what the objective criteria the Supreme Court arrived at this conclusion. There is also the question of centralization of election management. Do we need one big electoral body to manage our elections, or should election management be devolved to the states, the regions, or counties, as in the case of the United States? Should parties be allowed to second their members to the election management bodies? My answer to these two questions is yes. Here's my call to action. If Africa's elite autocrats are uniting against free and fair elections, Africa's democrats must also unite and defend democracy. We must build a continent-wide democracy coalition and look out for each other. The continent's democrats must treat the subversion of election anywhere on the continent as subversion of the people's will everywhere on the continent. It should be clear in the word and deed that whoever makes a move to ascend to power by means other than credible and constitutional elections is not only condemned, but subjected to sanctions and removal from such office. So far, the trend has been that an election malpractice that goes unpunished in one country provides a script for another country and then becomes the new normal. I will not go into details of my own country, Kenya, and the critics brewing there because of an election that was compromised in August last year. But Kenya's case must sound a warning to all. I am not a stranger to Nigeria. In fact, some other places they tell me that I'm a Nigerian. At one time I was arrested in Lagos when I was observing an election in 2003. And I was told, don't you know that today people are not supposed to be driving? The driver told him, I'm carrying an Oga. Then when they looked, there was, of course, we had a sticker. Then he came and looked at me and said, who, you? I said, yes, I'm an observer. you are Nigerian. I said, no, I'm not a Nigerian. Come on, man, don't play around with us. You are Nigerian. Eventually, when I showed my passport, then I realized I was not a Nigerian. But I'm saying that look, Nigeria has gone through very trying moments in our history. I remember the struggle for independence. I remember Zik. And I remember Awolo. Those were involved. The Sayoduna Sekoto. I remember Tafawa Balewa period. I remember the coming of Ironzi, the transition from civilian to military. I remember Yakub Gowon. And then I remember General Murtala Mohammed. I remember, of course, Papa Basanjo. Then the first transition to civilian. Then came the Shagari period, first Bambanginda, then the Butcher of Abuja, the Nabi Salam. Then I was here in the campaign of 1999. I was with Baba Basanjo and Falai, professor. I traveled around the country. I was here in Abuja, Nasarawa, Jos, Kano, Enugu, Anambra, down Port Harcourt. I was in Lagos, of course. I was in Beokuta, in Ibadan. So I know Nigeria. I know Nigeria, know the issues of elections in Nigeria. And I was observing the elections in Lagos when you had Tinubu and his other competitor. I was an observer of NDI-IRI team. So I know the challenges that Nigeria has faced in this period of democratization process. There have been gains and losses. I know the challenges you faced when Obasanjo, Atiku, then Yaradua, then Jonathan, and of course now the final one. You now have this phase here. So I know the challenges that have been here. I know there's some gains and losses. But what we want to say is that we should continue on the path of progress. I know that there have been mistakes which have been done, but we say we don't want to live in the past. We want to move in the future. We want to look at what is coming forward for the continent. So I want to say in conclusion that if the continent democrats, together with the international community of democracies, do not come together and defend the vote, the elections and democracy will be delegitimized in Africa with devastating consequences. As you face these elections next month, which is tomorrow's month, in February, we really want to urge Nigerians to stand firm and ensure that the voice of the people is respected. As they say in Latin, that vox populi, vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. We want to wish Nigeria all the best in these forthcoming elections. Thank you very much for listening to me.
We appreciate you indeed. Thank you. Ademola Kasumu, MD, Carl Springs, Mr. Chris Finebone, Honorable Commissioner of Information on Rivers State, representing His Excellency the Governor, Mr. Leko Abdul, MD, Bond Global Energy, Mr. Yinka Dewole, Mr. Uchene, and Benga Olubajo. Thank you for your support. Boa Foods and CEO, Engineer Ayodele Abioye, and Executive Director Ishaku Rabiu, thank you very much. And Malam Idado Ibrahim, representing the National Coordinator of Presidential Support Committee. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the Leadership Award has been on for years. And one characteristic of all of the people that has won this award reminds me of what the late Martin Luther King said. He said, if a man is called to be a street sweeper, he should sweep streets as Michelangelo painted, Beethoven composed music, and Shakespeare wrote poetry. He should sweep so well that all the hosts of heaven and earth will pause to say, here lived a great street sweeper who did his job well. And that's one trait amongst all of the award winners over the years. So what has this story been like? We have a short 5-minute documentary on the journey so far.
All this we owe both to ourselves and to the peoples of the world.
Leadership is not just about power